So I recently got the chance to play 4 hours of Star Wars Outlaws, and I have some thoughts. In case you're somehow not familiar with the game at this point, Star Wars Outlaws is a single-player, third-person action-adventure game set in the Star Wars universe, specifically set between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, which means we may be seeing some familiar characters, you never know. You play as Kay Vess, who is an outlaw accompanied by a little sidekick named Nix, and you embark on a grand adventure across several planets, some familiar to Star Wars fans and some never before seen. One of the other things that's notable about Star Wars Outlaws is that it's framed as the very first fully open world Star Wars game, which for a lot of people is pretty exciting. I mean, it's a little crazy that Star Wars is one of the biggest franchises known to mankind, and we've never actually had a fully open world, or I guess galaxy game set in this universe. It's wild. But that is evidently changing with Star Wars Outlaws. Now, Ubisoft very generously flew me and my editor Jacob out to Ubisoft Forward back in June, and at that event we got a little taste and I offered some impressions. But just to recap it, I thought that Star Wars Outlaws had a ton of potential and left me probably the most excited for any Ubisoft project that's currently going on. It seems like the team at Massive Entertainment have been working their butts off, and they might just have struck gold with this one. And so when Ubisoft reached out and offered to sponsor this video to give me the chance to play the game for a further 4 hours, I was like, okay, as long as I'm allowed to say whatever I want to say, and they put that in black and white in the contract. So I am contractually obligated to tell you everything I think, positive or negative. And it's mostly positive, though I do have a couple of things with Star Wars Outlaws that I'm either not sold on or that I just don't frankly like, but we'll get to that in a little bit. The point is, thank you to Ubisoft for sponsoring this video. All of the links, if you want to check out Star Wars Outlaws, will be in the description box below or in the pinned comment. You can check it out there. And with that said, let's just get into the nitty gritty. As I mentioned, I played for 4 hours, and this was mostly split into 2 parts, about 3 hours on one planet and then 1 hour on a different one. My time with the first planet was mostly about completing story objectives and freely exploring. It's my understanding that this portion of the game is very early on, and so it makes sense that we didn't have access to a whole lot of abilities. In fact, it was during this 3-hour session that we actually got to upgrade our blaster for the first time, gaining access to what is effectively an EMP shot that can break shields or overload droids, meaning that once you've unlocked this, you can specifically swap to the shooting mode that is relevant to the given situation. And frankly, the best way I think to talk about all of this is to just break it down instead of working linearly. So we're going to go through each given topic, which I'll have time-stamped, as you can see at the bottom of the video, so you can jump to the section you find particularly interesting if you feel so inclined. To begin, let's discuss the open world component. Now, even after 4 hours with the game, it's still unclear exactly how this will work. What we played was mostly linear, and while there were moments that we went into very wide open spaces on speeder bikes, for example, running away from a faction we pissed off, the actual quests and activities we were completing were very linear. This is why so many people have called this a mix of like Jedi Survivor and like Uncharted 3, and that's because they do blend in that way, at least what press and media have been able to play so far. Ubisoft keeps insisting that there is a major open world component to this. They're advertising it as the first Star Wars game ever with a fully open world and all of that, and I have no doubt eventually the game opens up and lets you do that. But all that we've gotten to play so far has been like the opening hours that are much more linear, where they're teaching you everything and keeping you on railroad tracks, basically. And then later, I'm sure they open it up and it's like, go explore, go do whatever, go wherever, whatever. We're not going to hold you back or anything. But I haven't seen any of that. And as far as I'm aware, no one else has. So that's still a big question mark for me and for everybody else. Is people are saying that this is open world and that that's a big component of this game, but we just haven't gotten a chance to really see how that works. The trailer at Ubisoft Forward definitely explained this a little bit, and some interviews with developers have expressed some of the open world components, but it still remains to be seen how exactly this is going to function. I'm excited to see how it works because I think that the worlds that they've built have a lot of potential to be explored freely and openly. There's all sorts of little side quests and side activities that I came across that we'll talk about in a few minutes that were very interesting, but I haven't seen exactly how this is going to play out in regular gameplay. This is Finley, by the way. He's being a trooper. He's going to the vet here later this afternoon, so we had to get some medicine to chill him out that the vet gave us, and he's not that happy with me right now. It apparently didn't taste very good. What I will say is that the open levels that we got to explore are gorgeous. If you got the chance to play Ubisoft Massive's previous game, Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora, you know exactly what they're capable of visually in these large open spaces. And seriously, they knocked it out of the park here too. Every blade of grass, every bush, every tree is all moving in the wind, and everything really does feel reactive and alive. And you don't realize how much that adds to a game with such large open environments until you start playing it, and then you're like, how did I live without this? Like, it's so much prettier when everything, even the stuff a mile away, is moving with the breeze that you, the character, are feeling yourself, and it's swaying with your hair and your clothes as the trees drift in the distance as well. It's those little touches that add so much, the little bit of attention to detail that really brings this above and beyond your standard, like, Ubisoft open world. But beyond this, we didn't really get a chance to explore. As I mentioned, most of what we were doing were linear activities where we needed to get from point A to point B, and we had a set amount of time to get through it. We were given 3 hours on the first planet, and we were told that about 2.5 hours worth of story content was assigned to us, so if we wanted to get through all of that, we needed to focus on it. And that's exactly what we did, but that meant there wasn't a whole lot of time for side exploration. So exploration in these big open areas might be really good, and I just didn't get the chance to see it, or it might be pretty bland and uninteresting. I'm just honestly not sure, since I didn't really get to sink my teeth into it. The next thing I want to talk about are the factions. This has been discussed at length by not just the game's developers, but also by the marketing team. In addition to this being the first truly open world Star Wars game, this also will feature a faction system where you have to keep different factions and your reputations with them in check and balanced. If you side too heavily with one faction, angering another one, you can expect to lose out on opportunities that the angered faction would have given you. And the same is true in reverse. The factions we saw were the Pike Syndicate, the Crimson Dawn, the Hutt Cartel, and the Ashiga clan. It's unclear if there will be more factions than this, and if this is just the factions we were interacting with at this point in the story, or what exactly it breaks down to. What I will say is I know some people were hoping that the Empire would be a faction that you have to juggle with as well, but from what I played and what I've experienced, it seems that the Empire is sort of its own thing. Think of like the cops in GTA 5 or any Grand Theft Auto game, where they're just the referees. So you can sort of like play around with them, and they are present in the story and stuff like that, but it's not like you can join that faction, which sort of makes sense. I mean, it's called Star Wars Outlaws, for God's sake, and you're playing an outlaw who's not a member of the Empire, so it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to build out that faction when it's not something Kay would ever engage with. And I mean, just think about it for 10 seconds. If they were to allow you to become friendly with the Empire or join them as a faction, then what happens when you commit like crimes and the wanted level goes up that they've talked about? They just wouldn't attack you because you're a member of the faction, so then you can just get away with whatever you want. It just would break down really quickly. So maybe the Empire is a faction that comes in later, or maybe it's just not. Either way, I didn't see it, and I don't think it's a big deal either which way. The factions we did get to interact with were varied and interesting and had all different assignments and quests, and each one had a different vibe associated with them. The Crimson Dawn I found incredibly annoying, and their general attitude of being holier than thou was exhausting, so I did everything I could to tick them off and side with every other faction, which meant eventually I had a negative reputation with them and I lost out on opportunities they would have offered me, but it did mean that whenever I would be completing an objective for another faction, I got to fight these guys in combat instead of members of a different faction. And this plays out while you're going through other objectives as well. At one point, I was riding on my speeder bike to a main story objective, and I came across a farm that was occupied by members of a faction that I had a good reputation with. Not thinking, I just opened fire on them and started fighting, and it caused my reputation to nosedive, which I realized would be a very bad thing if I did so casually, so I went back, reloaded, and then didn't mess with them so it wouldn't affect my reputation. And that's exactly what you should hope for from a faction-based system like this, that there are actual consequences for double-crossing, or in this case, just downright assaulting a faction you are allegedly friendly with. So I was pretty impressed with the faction system. It's pretty black and white. You either have a neutral reputation with a faction, a good reputation with a faction, a bad reputation with a faction, or an extreme reputation with a given faction, positive or negative. And that's just a really wordy way of saying that you are either neutral, you have a good or bad reputation, or you have a very good or very bad reputation with them. And it seems like if you cross over to like very bad, if you are seen by members of that faction, they are immediately aggroed to you. Whereas very good, you get better deals on loot. There were certain shopkeepers that had items that were locked away behind certain reputational levels. So if you had a very good reputation, you could get this really rare item. Otherwise, you just couldn't buy it from them. And systems like that, once again, are exactly, in my opinion, how you should be implementing a faction system like this. Your decisions have impacts not just within the story, as far as we can tell, but also within the actual gameplay, allowing you to buy certain things that affect gameplay if you have good reputations with one faction versus the other. This also could lead to situations where replay value is increased, because if you want to go through the game going one route, you might miss out on things that you don't see simply because you didn't side with that faction that has those relevant quests. For example, with the Hutt cartel, I would fully expect that having a good reputation with the Hutts would lead to situations where you could see Jabba the Hutt much more frequently. Whereas if you have a really negative reputation with that faction, you're probably less likely to run into him. Since after all, they wouldn't have much reason to invite someone openly hostile towards them to their boss's hideout. Now moving on to the broader gameplay discussion. This I'm going to break down into a few separate categories: the social gameplay, stealth gameplay, combat, speeder bikes, ship combat and flight, exploration, and upgrades. The first one is social gameplay. This is like going up to NPCs and talking with them based on your reputation with certain factions, trying to convince them to do one thing or the other. In a quest that we did, we wanted to speak with the head of a given faction and convince him to do something for us that I won't spoil. As part of that, we had to figure out how to get to the penthouse where he was staying. So we could speak to the bartender and try to convince them to let us up, or we could pay somebody for a key to get straight up to the top of the penthouse, or we could go around the corner and convince one of the custodians to let us into a maintenance room that has an access to open up the elevator and let us up to the top. This was cool because it was an instance of your reputation system even coming back to help you during main quest activities. And it seems like this is going to happen a handful of times. I encountered it maybe 4 or 5 times during the few hours that I was playing. So I fully expect that this is going to be a main feature of the gameplay. What I'm really interested in is how this evolves as the gameplay hours tick up and your reputation with certain factions probably becomes even more extreme. I imagine as you reach the end of the game, you maybe have a very bad relationship with, say, the Hutts or the Crimson Dawn, and a very good relationship with the Ashiga clan and the Pike Syndicate. And so I want to know how that would affect not just the side content, but also the main story stuff. Are there new routes or endings, or maybe routes you could go on the final mission / heist or something that you don't get access to if you're sided over here? That all is up in the air, but I'm excited to find out about it, which is a good thing because it means that I can see there's potential here and it's exciting and interesting. And if they can live up to the expectation they've set here, they could hit it out of the park. With regard to stealth gameplay, the AI of enemies is fine. Patrols are pretty standard, as you would expect in an adventure game like this. They operate with clear sight lines and they have your standard radius of hearing. So if there is some sort of sound near them, they can pick up on that as well. And they can also be distracted with nicks or other environmental hazards so that you pull their attention away from a location you need to get to or an enemy you need to take out. It worked fine, but I did notice multiple times where I would take out an enemy that was maybe 20 feet away from one of his buddies on patrol walking around, and after I would take them out and they just lay there on the ground passed out, I would leave and it would never draw the attention. It would never set off any alarms. Again, I don't know if it's just because I moved on fast enough that maybe that body despawned and so it wasn't an issue. I'm not sure, but there were at least 2 occasions where I thought that body's going to be found and somebody's going to freak out about it, as they probably should. But it never really came up again. It never caused any issues. It's also during a lot of the stealth sequences when you're going to be engaging with different mini games, such as this glyph one, which is used to open doors a lot, as is this rhythm game puzzle, which is also used on doors a lot. The glyphs are really simple and operate pretty much exactly like the game Wordle, if you're familiar with that. You have to set up these symbols in a given order. It'll tell you if one symbol is used in the final answer of the puzzle, but is in the wrong location. It'll also tell you if it's in the right location. location. So after a couple rounds of trial and error, you will eventually get it and you can move on. There is an accessibility option to replace these symbols and glyphs for numbers to make it a little bit easier if you'd prefer to go that way, which I thought I would mention. As for the rhythm puzzle, this is really straightforward. It flashes a light and plays a sound, and once you get that rhythm down, you press the indicated button in the same rhythm at the same time, and when you do that, it unlocks the door and you move on. This is actually probably my favorite lockpicking mini game of any game I've probably ever played. I don't know why, it just scratches a part of my brain I didn't know I had. It's just really satisfying to like go up to a door and hear click, 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 click. And then you do that in the same rhythm and all of a sudden the door unlocks. It's so satisfying. I don't know how to describe it. Maybe I'm the only one that feels this way, but I loved this minigame. It's so much better than like the old school, like move this lockpick at this angle and this, and then eventually it'll unlock. This is way better. It's also during a lot of these stealth sequences when you will start platforming. And this is probably the biggest gripe that I have with Star Wars Outlaws. I'm sorry, but these platforming sequences are just not very good. They were the low point of every mission that involved them. I just don't like them. There were so many times where I would jump at a platform and she just wouldn't grab on the way I was expecting her to, or I'd jump onto a platform that didn't look like you could stand on it, but you could, and then you're supposed to jump from there onto a wall and grab onto it, but I didn't realize you could jump onto the wall and grab onto it because it wasn't clearly indicated. And again, maybe it's just because we were playing a vertical slice of the game and previously they condition you to grab onto those grates more frequently, or you have a better understanding of the platforming. I don't know, but what I do know is that these platforming sections were always just frustrating and annoying. I didn't die in my time with the game at like Summer Game Fest, except during the platforming when I jumped off a ledge because she didn't grab onto something that she was supposed to be able to grab onto. So the platforming is annoying and frustrating. Hopefully it tightens up in the final release. And maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just really bad at this, but that was one thing I just frankly did not like. As for combat, I would say it's generally good. Using cover is a bit inconsistent, but stealth was always an option in the missions that I played. Many traps are also available to take out multiple enemies at one time, and you can even rig things to explode, for example, using nicks so that you don't alert anybody to your presence. They just chalk it up to a malfunctioning control panel or something else. I definitely got the vibe that the game leans much more heavily into stealth encounters than it does straight all-out combat. And while combat is an option, it's definitely going to be a little bit clunkier and more difficult to get through than if you just stealthed your way out of situations. Some people will love this because in sort of a meta narrative sense, it makes sense because like Kay taking on 15 members of an established clan probably should not be a super easy thing to do. It probably should be a difficult challenge to overcome, but also it's a video game, so I don't think anybody's going to look at it too closely. But I would say that combat is generally fine. It's nothing to write home about, and often it was over as quickly as it began. The encounters were always pretty short and small in scope. Again, that could just be because we were playing an early section of the game and the difficulty and complexity cranks up later. I'm not sure. There have been some trailers and things that have shown some bigger creatures and let's just say encounters, and for those I'm very, very excited. But based on what we played, it was all pretty straightforward, not particularly challenging, but also not bad by any means. It was just fine. One thing I did enjoy more than I thought I would were the speeder bike races and side activities that you could engage with. As I've alluded to a few times, some of these levels have very wide open spaces for you to explore. And for these, you basically need to use your speeder bike, as running on foot is going to be extremely slow in comparison. There were also all sorts of upgrades for speeder bikes and for your ship that we'll talk about in a little bit. And I could see these being very, very useful, as the starter speeder bike is fast, sure, but not quite as fast as what we've seen in some of the other trailers and stuff. So I would assume once you upgrade the bike, it can get real fast. Speaking of going fast, the ship combat and flight was something we thankfully got the chance to experiment with. The controls for the ship combat and flight are definitely much more rigid than a game like, say, Starfield, where the ships control very nimbly. Is nimbly a word? I think it is. I'm going with it. I'm committing. If I had to describe the control system, I would say it works just like your standard standard third-person adventure game with flight or planes controllable in the game. It's nothing to write home about, but it definitely gets the job done, which makes sense. This is not trying to be like a space sim Star Wars game. It's trying to be more pop culture Star Wars, which is totally fine. There is nothing wrong with that, but don't go into this thinking that you're gonna have to like juggle fuel injectors or fuel distribution or anything like that. As for ship combat, it was pretty straightforward. The encounters were pretty small, but again, that might have just been because we were playing an early section of the game. Speaking of being early in the game though, we were playing with largely unupgraded ships, weapons, and speeder bikes. We could see that there were ways to upgrade or repair different components of our ships, such as having laser turrets or improved rockets or cannons and things, but we didn't actually get to see what those would look like or how they would play. So I fully expect that this will grow even more impressive as time goes on and as you upgrade your ship. But based on what we played, we were playing on the starter ship with no upgrades, nothing else added. And I really want to stress that because I don't want anybody to go and leave this video thinking like, okay, well, this is all they've got. Like, we're playing the opening hours. We're not playing with a final character. Like when you're playing a game such as I don't know, any given RPG, the starter weapons and items suck. Like even with Baldur's Gate 3, for example, you start with like the basic of the basic weapon and it's going to do almost nothing to high level enemies. And the encounters are all going to be super simple because they're teaching you the game. As it goes on, it gets more complex. They give you cooler stuff and then it picks up speed and gets really cool. But that takes time. They're not going to show you everything they have in their hand right at the outset in the first half hour. It wouldn't make any sense. So just because the session we played didn't have a lot of end game components or upgrades or anything doesn't mean those are missing or absent. It just means that we didn't see it because we were playing an early section of the game. Again, I'm sure 99% of you guys get that, but I'm sure if I don't clarify that, there's going to be somebody in the comments that's like confused. So I'll just clarify it. There was also a good amount of side content that surprised me, frankly. As I mentioned earlier, there were speeder bike races, so you could actually go on to the speeders and race NPCs and stuff. That was cool to see. We also had the chance to bet on races with weird alien horses, and this was initially pretty daunting and intimidating. Basically, they give you the profile of each of the given horses. They tell you what their current form is. They tell you how they've performed in the last few races. They tell you who the jockey effectively is, descriptions of the animal itself with its age, height, and weight. And if you look at all of this information, you can place bets and potentially win. And this information does indicate which one is more likely to win the race versus the others, which is kind of cool, honestly. Like I could see a situation where somebody gets really good at this mini game and is just printing money as a result. But one interesting thing that my demoist let me know about was that apparently when you're playing the game and exploring the open world, you can find NPCs that are just talking. Like, you know how you walk by a bar and NPCs might have just casual dialogue playing? If you walk by some of those NPCs occasionally, very rarely, but it'll happen, you will find NPCs who are talking about these races. And he said sometimes they might let some information slip that could help you choose a winner in an up-and-coming race, or pick one of the horses or jockeys that is going to throw the race or something like that. Maybe they're a fan favorite, but they're actually going to throw the race because they're intentionally betting against themselves. Because again, there's a broader theme within Star Wars Outlaws of the underworld and being an outlaw. So very few things are actually what they seem. And I just thought that was really cool. The idea that you could just be freely exploring, doing something totally different, and then overhear an NPC talking about this one jockey who's going to throw the race. And then you use that in this other mini game and you get basically an advantage in that. That's super cool to me and I love it. One of the other little things is that there's a card game basically in Star Wars Outlaws, and you can actually use Nix to like sneak under the table, peek up at the other player's cards, and then come back and tell you what they were, which is just like, it makes sense. You know, we're playing scumbag outlaws. So yeah, it makes sense that we'd be able to cheat in a game like this. It's just very thematically on point, and there's a lot of little mini games like that you'll come across, and they all are pretty well thought out and have some of those added complexities. As for side quests, we didn't get the chance to engage with much of these. As I said, we were pretty much stuck on the main story for most of our time, but there were some that I came across. There were bounty hunters we could accept contracts with. There was a time where I came across some farmers that were being attacked by a group of raiders that we could step in and defend, and many, many more. Seriously, there was a lot here. There were wide open spaces that were just wide and open without much in them, but usually on the outskirts of those areas, if you started looking for farmhouses or groups of people and NPCs, you would usually find something of interest. It's also during a lot of this side content that you're going to be collecting or searching for loot and components that are needed for upgrades. And while you occasionally may find a new pair of pants or a new belt or jacket, usually you would find components that are going to be useful in upgrading your equipment, like your blaster. As for improving your own skills, this is done with a pretty interesting system. It's just called abilities, but basically, characters that you'll meet as you go through the game will give you a series of like perks, and really the best way to think of it is kind of like how the leveling system in Starfield worked, where there's a perk, but the way you level it up is by engaging with activities and clearing certain challenges associated with that skill. So if you want to improve, say, your shooting with a blaster, or you want to improve the accuracy, or you want to improve the damage output, or you want to be able to slide as you run, those all will be tied to challenges that are specific to combat in that same style. Similarly to how, like in Skyrim, if you want to level up two-handed weapons, you have to use two-handed weapons to gain the ability points in that specific skill. Like, it only makes sense if you're going to do that thing and you want to be better at it, you got to do the thing you're trying to get better at. And in the time that I spent with the game, I unlocked a couple of new abilities and it worked pretty well. But just like in those other games, it could eventually get a little frustrating if you have some upgrade you want to do and you're really excited for it. But in order to get it, you have to go grind out 10 headshots with your blaster, or you got to go and find 5 of these items while exploring, or open 15 chests to unlock this perk rank or whatever. It can get a little tedious and annoying. It's fine if it happens organically while you're just playing the game and you're like, oh, piece of candy, I got an upgrade. But it all depends on how it's balanced. And again, it's just really hard to gauge when you only are playing a little sliver of the game that's cut out of, you know, the first few hours. So we'll keep an eye on this. Initially, I'm not opposed to the idea. I like the idea that to upgrade something, you have to do that something, but it could also just be a series of challenges that could turn into busy work. It's kind of up in the air. What's not up in the air are the visuals. This game is gorgeous. The art direction is tremendous. The sound design is classically Star Wars in every great way possible. It is super immersive. The NPC density is incredibly high, so you feel like you're actually navigating true living areas that are filled with people going about their daily lives. And there's tons of little attention to details, such as going out in the snow, seeing snow collect on your jacket, and then when you walk inside and stand near objects that run hot or vents blowing out hot air, you can see the snow melt on Kay's jacket in real time. And there's so many little details like this. They have paid attention to all of it. And again, there's even little stuff like the wind blowing outside of the bar where you meet one of your faction connections, and the shutters inside the bar are blowing with the wind that was ravaging the fields outside. Like, there's so many little touches that just make the worlds that they've created feel very unified, and they've clearly thought through, hey, if the world were like this, what would this be like? And then how would that impact this? And how would that follow from this? And it's cool to see, and it's fun to explore, which is why I'm excited to eventually get to try just freely exploring this game, because I feel like there is the potential for a lot of really cool and interesting things to be hidden around little corners, and a lot of those little pieces of attention to detail to come to light. And lastly, as for the story itself, honestly, it's really, really hard to gauge something like story in a session like this. I mean, just think of any game with a good story that you know of, and you think of playing like 2.5, 3 hours of one level and then bouncing to another level, and you've never experienced any of that story before. It's really hard to figure out what's going on, how these people know each other, what their personality is like, and why they act that way towards you. Is that because of something you did, or is that just who they are? all of those things are just up in the air because you just don't know. You're playing a little sliver of the game out of context. So it's really hard to gauge. What I will say is I still am not really sure what the main impetus of the game is. Like, what's the big pressing quest? I know we've seen in like the narrative trailer some hints as to what's going on, where you committed this heist and then you got in trouble and now you're trying to kind of dig yourself out of the hole that you were in and stuff like that. But I feel like there's probably more going on in the story, and I still have not really been able to decipher it. So I will be keeping an eye on the game, and hopefully closer to launch, or maybe just at launch, we get a better idea of what the game is. But as of right now, it seems like just your standard Han Solo light story where they're just coming in there. They're like, hey, you're a scoundrel and you're going to go do scoundrel things and have a good time while doing it. Don't take it too seriously, but there's going to be some fun mechanics for you to play with, and some beautiful places for you to visit. And that, honestly, for me, is just fine. I mean, I'm just looking for a fun Star Wars game that's beautiful, immersive, and has some interesting stuff in it. And honestly, it seems like Star Wars Outlaws has all of that. It's not perfect, but no game is. There are, of course, some little things that I can point to and I'm like, yeah, the platforming I don't really like. Thankfully, it's kind of few and far between, and it's pretty rare that you actually engage with it. But other than that, like, the game's pretty solid. And of course, we're talking about a game that has not come out yet. I'm playing a build that's months and months old by the time the game comes out. So the odds are pretty high that a lot of the little bitty frustrations, such as maybe AI responses or the platforming being inconsistent, those things could likely be fixed by the time the final game comes around. And all of the core mechanics and systems here are promising, exciting, or just downright good. And it gets me pretty excited. I'm feeling pretty good about Star Wars Outlaws after trying this, which is awesome, because this was one of those games that kind of came out of nowhere and has just consistently been pretty impressive. And now, having played 4 hours of it, I can say it plays pretty well as well. I still think, based on what I've played, it's a good merger of like Uncharted 3, not as like intensely narrative as Uncharted 4, but Uncharted 3-ish blended together with like Star Wars Jedi Survivor. And that's high praise, because both of those games are great. It's just not really the open world adventure Ubisoft game that I think I was expecting, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. But with all of that said, I am very excited to see how Star Wars Outlaws turns out. I am very thankful for Ubisoft for giving me the chance to play the game and allowing me to say whatever I want. Because how often do you get a company that sponsors you to try one of their games that's up and coming, and then they're like, yeah, and say whatever you want. Like, you have to. If you lie, or if you just try to give us a fluff piece, we're not cool anymore. Like, that's pretty awesome that they're that open and willing to hear that feedback. So I am just very, very pleased with how all of this is going down. I'm excited to see more, and hopefully you learned a little something about Star Wars Outlaws and enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to like the video. That helps me out a ton. Subscribe, check out my second channel, Luke Stevens Live, for all sorts of extra content. Live streams, live stream highlights, stuff like that. But with all that said, thank you for watching. I love the gosh darn heck out of each and every single one of you. Thank you for making my dreams a reality, and I'll see you in the next one. Hugs and kisses. Bye-bye.